Well, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webcast session brought to you by Wolters Kluwer and also supported by Minter Ellison. In today's session, the topic is managing data in the new ATO world, and it's a fantastic opportunity for us to talk to you and talk from a couple of experienced people about where the ATO are coming from in relation to some of their more recent activity around information requests of corporations, and also then provide you with some further insights about the practicalities of preparing yourself for those questions and ensuring that you're able to defend your corporations. Joining me today, I have Carmen McElwain from Minter Ellison and also Tony Katsigarakis from Wolters Kluwer. I'll just quickly give you a bit of a background on the co-presenters today. So Carmen is the head of Minter Ellison's tax controversy practice. Carmen has over 25 years experience in managing large and complex tax controversy matters at the risk review and audit stages and in the conduct of tax litigation. Carmen has managed some of the largest transfer pricing audits conducted in Australia on behalf of companies in the automotive, telecommunications and financial services companies. This includes a strong focus on success record in early resolution. Carmen also advises high wealth individuals and large corporations, including large financial institutions, on overall tax risk management strategies. This includes a strong focus, again, on a success record in early engagement with the ATO to achieve tax certainty and early resolution of any disputes. Carmen is also trusted advisor to the ATO and is also the ATO client relationship partner at Minter Ellison, responsible for the ATO for all tax appeals litigation and complex debt recovery matters conducted nationally in the Federal Court, Commonwealth Administration Tribunal, High Court and State Supreme Courts. Joining Carmen today we have Tony Katsigarakis. Now Tony Katsigarakis is from the Wolters Kluwer business. He has close to 30 odd years experience in the tax technology domain and is actually considered one of the leaders in the industry in terms of awareness and understanding of tax process technology and how to ensure that you are managing risk appropriately with the highest levels of automation and compliance process. Tony has a long background both through service advisor capacity, also in in-house corporate capacity, and most recently over the last 15 years in developing software to support corporations and their service providers. So welcome Carmen and Tony, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Just before you get started, a couple of administrative points. For today's webcast, as you heard before, we do have the online webcast capability, so that includes your ability to ask questions and be involved in the conversation. I encourage you all to send through questions as early as you like or whenever you like throughout the session. I'll have them here coming up on screen, and I can then interject them into the conversation at the right point. So thanks everyone for your attendance today. Just a minor point too, we have close to 400 people on the session today, so it certainly demonstrates the interest that you all have in this very interesting topic. So, Carmen.
Thank you, Jimmy. Well, I'll just do this. No. There you go. Oop. So what we're going to be talking today about is managing data in the new ATO world. And my particular focus and interest in that is largely due to the work that I've been doing and immersed in for particularly the last couple of years, but more intensively over the last 18 months in assisting clients to manage their audits or risk reviews, and particularly where the ATO is requesting information and gathering data and evidence as part of that review. So the reference to New World is about the intensive way that the ATO is conducting this phase of a review or an audit where they're seeking information. And I have to say the ATO has become much more focused, proactive and very strict in the way they are applying that. So that has that creates significant implications for the way companies are managing their data and having that data available to produce to the ATO, because in the way that the ATO is now insisting on that data being produced. So we are seeing that in real time and in ways that companies are being quite challenged quite significantly in their ability to respond and also to respond in the way that the ATO is prescribing to meet very strict timelines. The other area that I think is a surprise to a lot of companies and also causes them not to be prepared is the breadth and depth of the information requests that the ATO is issuing. And they are doing this at the audit stage, particularly. Initially, they do it in the context of an informal request, but very significant requests nonetheless. And if they are not managed appropriately, then that could have consequences for then the company being issued with a more formal request. So it's in that context that I'm talking about data management.
Yes.
And why it's extremely important to have a process, particularly with significant transactions, for keeping, storing data contemporaneous to the transaction, but also doing it in a way that speaks to the method that the ATO is now adopting.
And Carmen, before the session you were talking about the duration that the ATO might be retrospectively looking at for some of these transactions.
Well, if the ATO will select a transaction, and sometimes they might be looking at different issues, but usually focusing on a particular transaction. And our experience is mainly in relation to some of these large transfer pricing audits. But the ATO, for example, if it is focusing on a particular transaction that was a change, for example, a capital, a restructure, the ATO will not only ask questions about that particular transaction, which includes decision-making process, what the commercial drivers were behind that transaction, and what advice was provided, what other options were considered. But the ATO is now going back further to the previous structure, if it was a restructure, and saying, well, why did you have that structure and what caused you to change it? Who were the decision makers? So the breadth of the ATO's inquiries, I think, are catching people by surprise, and where companies are questioning, well, why is this relevant to the particular issue that's under review? However, the ATO is strictly enforcing the requirement to provide that information.
So, Carmen, when taxpayers are being asked to go that far back in their history, what are you actually observing in terms of their ability to respond to those questions and find the supporting evidence that they need?
Well, it depends on the circumstances of the company, of course. And what I should say is that the Tax Office not only seeks information from the taxpayer in Australia in relation to information that is onshore, but usually because these transactions involve a parent that is offshore, if they're related transactions, the ATO is seeking information from the parent or a shareholder or whatever it is, which might be offshore. So to that extent, it can present significant challenges to obtain that information, particularly in the most part where people have moved on from within the organisation. And so archives need to be interrogated to gather the information that's responsive to the requests. And also then, because the information requests don't just request data or documents, they also ask questions which require a response. So often it's a combination. The challenge is to bring together those people who can actually shed light and put the company in a position to answer the question, but also to provide the documents. And you know, a lot of the documents that are necessary to or that are requested by the ATO are the internal documents like emails, because the ATO wants to gain an understanding of how decisions were made and what the various roles are within the company that had a bearing on the particular transaction. So so that can really undermine a company's inability to respond, particularly within the timelines that the ATO is insisting upon now, which are much abridged timelines to, you know, what used to be the case where you could sort of negotiate and extend time quite comfortably in my view, where there used to be more realistic timeframes. Now we are working to a very strict timetable set by the ATO, and they are insisting that that is adhered to.
In terms of opportunities to seek extensions of those ATO expected or requested timeframes, what's your experience with companies' ability to request for additional time?
It depends. Sometimes it depends on the history that the company has with the tax office, and in particular during the course of the particular engagement being a risk review and through the audit. However, what we're seeing, even with the most compliant, cooperative, open, transparent companies who've got a very good history with the ATO in their engagements and in their providing information, the ATO is insisting on strict timeframes because they are imposing their own internal procedures and meeting and the particular timelines they have on you. So that's part of what we're referring to as the new ATO world, because I think that's a significant change that people are being caught by surprise. So, for example, we had a situation recently where our client received a very significant information request. We tried to assess what was going to be involved, and the client sought to engage with the ATO to explain what their issues were internally, the logistics. But the ATO said, well, we have to treat taxpayers consistently across the board. We also have a timetable. Our client requested an extra few weeks, but the ATO was only prepared to give 3 weeks,
right,
which is going to cause significant challenge for our client. And not only that, but the ATO is also insisting that the information is being provided in a particular way, certain information being provided ahead of other information, which is also what we're seeing, I think, is part of a new strategy by the ATO as well.
So what are some examples of the information requests that you've seen being asked of corporations, and you're finding there's a common theme? And
yes, there is. Look, the ATO is wanting to understand the decision-making behind why a company has sought to adopt a particular structure, to adopt a particular financing arrangement, as opposed to other options. And these elements that the ATO is seeking to understand are also referable to the legislation they're seeking to apply, particularly the transfer pricing provisions around 815B mainly now, or there could be some legacy 815A issues, and also significantly, potentially, the diverted profits tax provisions, because they do require an abridged time frame as well. And so I think that from within the tax office, they have sought to apply their strategy to request this type of information, to also observe how they want to apply the legislation or the provisions and the sorts of things they want to understand.
Yes.
But it's the decision-making process, it's facts about the transaction, who made decisions onshore and offshore, what options were other options were considered, why the particular option was adopted, and also questions around the advice that was provided around that time, and it's all focused on contemporaneous information.
Yep.
And of course that brings in issues around accounting advisors, concession, legal professional privilege.
Yes.
So and those things have to be worked through very quickly. Even, the biggest task is to gather the information.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's the challenges of ensuring that in these big transactions that contemporaneous information is actually captured in a way that puts the company in a position to be responsive so that it doesn't create risk for the company in dealing with the tax office.
Yep. So I think both of you, Tony and Carmen, will have seen a lot of corporations over the last few years putting in place really strong tax risk management frameworks to mitigate, I guess, against the eventual and inevitable inquiries that are coming through. So can you perhaps both talk to some of your experiences? Maybe, Tony, you could go first on what you're seeing in terms of what corporations are doing in terms of putting in place stronger systems and processes to defend themselves for the inevitable questions.
So it's probably fair to say that it's fairly early days at the moment. So we're seeing an emerging consciousness of being able to put systems in place and processes in place and reviews in place to be able to identify anomalies and to support the tax positions taken. The larger organisations, like the banks particularly, are really starting to put in some fairly strong frameworks, but it is very early days. So the organisations are really just starting to respond, I guess, to the level of inquiry that's coming out of the ATO. What's interesting, just based on our conversations earlier, is how far back the ATO is going sometimes, and I'm not sure that they're necessarily looking that far back. I think a lot of organisations are starting to look prospectively. They're starting to run a level of data analytics, although I think the perception of the level that's required is well below what they actually require. Some companies are starting to run trend analysis, really dig into the data a little bit, but it's just based on our discussions a little bit earlier, they're probably not quite prepared to meet the breadth and depth that the ATO is going into. So, Carmen, you mentioned a little bit earlier, how far back are you seeing some of the inquiries go?
Oh, some inquiries are asking for information going back 10 years, sometimes even longer. And what you have, I think we discussed it before, the difficulty with that is where you have people who have left the organisation. I mean, we're seeing lots of cases where where no one in the company that was involved at the time of the transaction is still involved or still present in the company now at the time of the review or the audit, I should say. And so therefore it presents significant challenges for the company, not only whilst they may have stored emails going that far back in archives, what you don't have access to is the decision-making processes, because again, the other really important aspect of all of this, it's not just about gathering documents, which is extremely important to have your documents stored in a particular way, but the ATO is also asking questions about the decision making and why decisions were being made, and often that can only be answered to respond to the question appropriately by those people who were involved at the time of the transaction. So, there are a lot of challenges presented, and, companies, I think, are being caught by surprise by the depth and breadth of what the ATO is asking for. And we are seeing that, there are difficulties, and unfortunately what that occurs, what then that can give rise to is a possible perception on the part of the ATO that the company's not being responsive or cooperative, and then that can give rise to other issues.
Of course, yeah.
Yes.
Have you actually seen any companies that are well prepared to be able to answer any of that historical inquiry?
Some are better prepared, but most are not prepared for the breadth of the questions and the document requests, because in a lot of cases, well, in practically all cases, the time is taken up initially by just working out where the data could possibly be. And that's where a lot of time is used of the timeline that the tax office sets, and how one goes about searching for the information within the organisation, and gathering that information from the advisors and how one deals with that. So I'd have to say, in the most part, no, I haven't seen anyone that's really prepared, but I think that's because there's not an awareness or an understanding of what the ATO is doing in terms of the nature of what is being asked for, and also how quickly they are wanting that to be put together and responded.
Have you had situations where the deadline was set but wasn't met, and how's the ATO responded to that?
Well, yes, I have. And again, it depends on, well, it varies in different situations. You have situations where there have been deadlines set in the context of an informal request. The ATO usually starts with an informal request. However, the informal request is usually in the same form as one would get in a formal request, and that includes for onshore as well as offshore information. Where the deadlines have not been met in the context of, say, an informal request, what that gives rise to is fairly intense engagement with the ATO. The ATO will usually want to understand, and this is another area which I think has caught some of us by surprise in terms of the level of inquiry, and that is the ATO will want to know how you went about searching for the data, how you're applying your resources to satisfy itself in terms of how committed you have been to meeting the deadlines. And however, in all cases, companies are committed to apply the resources, but often you only start to understand what it is you're dealing with once you're in the process and the time is ticking. And that's where it's really quite challenging. So it's hard to be prepared.
So a lot of corporate tax functions are probably not that data and systems focused. So I think when they're getting questions like this, they don't necessarily have a tax system that's housing all this information. So they've got to deal with internal technology departments to search through emails and go through old document stores.
Right.
And a lot of this information could have been archived, so sitting in secondary data stores. So are you seeing corporations investing a little bit more into data management platforms that are again, allowing them to house all this information in one place should the inevitable question come up?
I'm not seeing a huge amount of that, I've got to say.
Yeah, right.
But even where that does occur, and the information storage you would usually regard it as quite good, I think what needs to occur is a better understanding of what is required, what you are likely to need to retrieve from that system to meet an information request by the ATO in the way that the ATO is now conducting those information requests. And I think that's where, particularly in significant transactions, and the ATO is quite transparent about the sorts of transactions it's going to want to look at. I think there is a case for when such a transaction occurs, that a review is undertaken about, how do we store and capture the story about this transaction, having regard to what we know, the ATO is likely to ask us. And I know in the past when I've talked about those sorts of things, companies have, understandably said, well, look, we'll probably deal with that when the time comes. But when the time comes, what we're seeing is it's logistically very, very difficult. Companies are just not prepared. Yep. And also, even though where they think they have been, it's because of the way the ATO is doing it now. And also that places the company at risk in terms of getting a formal request, and where those timelines are not met, that does cause the sort of risk you're talking about, Tony, where if information is not provided within the timeline set by a formal notice where it's mandatory onshore to provide that information, then you could have a statutory breach, and companies don't want to do that. So there are issues there.
It's interesting, that reflects our experience. In our world, we often talk to clients in the context of compliance, and we always talk about the importance of gathering your evidence and keeping it all in one place. And invariably, we have these surprised looks saying, oh, what do you mean? It's like, well, you look at where you keep your information, and it's emails, it's in people's heads, it's on paper files, it's on hard drives that disappear. And then when the time comes to try and collate it together, and you ask them a question, they can tell you about the current year compliance, but we always ask the question, well, what happens 2 or 3 years hence when the tax office knocks on your door and asks the questions, where are you going to find that information? And there's not a consciousness of actually trying to bring that evidence together.
Correct, yeah.
And it's interesting, like when we talk about evidence, you've mentioned sometimes when they finally do collate the evidence, sometimes there's surprises in terms of what they think that evidence supports versus what it actually supports.
Yes. One of the other risks in all of this is that because you have a situation where you're being asked questions as well as, the ATO has always asked questions, but in this context where it's all being requested in such a tight time frame, what can occur is companies will say, well, look, we can gather the data and we'll answer the questions or start drafting answers to the questions, and they're focused very much on data gathering to respond to the document requests. But what occurs is when you're answering the questions, sometimes where you're relying on recollection, which is often an efficient thing to do if you're just seeking to answer a question of people's recollections of what occurred, sometimes the documents don't bear that out. Or sometimes the documents need explaining, or sometimes the documents just plainly contradict what the recollection was, or give a different perspective or impression, or only certain of the data has been gathered and not the rest, and a document that might be contradictory or may give a different impression that needs explanation, or could be an early draft, exists somewhere else that then gets produced to the ATO. So these are the risks that are particularly heightened by the very strict timelines the ATO is imposing. And so that's why it's important for, I think, this work and data, whether we call it data managing or data storage or on a transaction basis, needs to be closely looked at.
Carmen, you had a couple of slides that you're referencing there. Do we have those on screen as well?
Sorry, I wasn't sure.
It's all right.
It wasn't working.
Yeah. We might.
Am I doing that?
Yeah, other way.
Other way, okay.
There we go. Rightio. Great.
Now, had that slide been up, I would have referred to that
That's all right.
at the beginning. But it does give, this is a quote from Chris Jordan, it really does show the intent behind a lot of the way that the ATO is proceeding now, and they are getting behind what's happened. And it is Chris Jordan, Jeremy Hirschhorn and Mark Conza who are directly supervising these matters. And in our interactions with the ATO on some of these cases where we do need extensions of time, if you are pursuing a longer extension of time, then what we are being told, it has to be escalated to these people who are going to make decisions, and they are also strictly enforcing these timelines. So that's another area that people need to be aware.
There's a question that's come in from the audience in relation to the ATO's focus and whether or not it's shifting from the larger multinationals down to the SME or small to medium enterprise.
At the moment, we're seeing it's the larger multinational. That's where I think the Commissioner is investing significant resources as a priority, because I would imagine they see the risk is greater there that they need to get a handle on. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if this process is also brought down to that next level, particularly where the ATO determines that there is significant risks or considers a taxpayer to be in that, or transaction to be in a high risk category. So I think we've dealt with this slide. I've just put up a slide about the diverted profits tax reviews to just demonstrate here again, even though a particular transactions being audited with respect to in relation to transfer pricing, we know that the ATO is referring responses. Once they get responses to these, some of these information requests, to what they're calling the DPT experts or team. And you will see here that the timelines where the ATO is looking to abridge the times in order to make decisions, and also the timelines in relation to assessment, review periods, etc. Well, the ATO is seeking to also work to or speak to the issues that they're looking at in the context of DPT through the same process that we've just been talking about in relation to other audits. The other aspect of this is, quite apart from the DPT, the ATO is generally looking to shorten the time that we normally see in these, or have been used to in these large transfer pricing audits, where they could go on for years. I think the ATO has very little patience, and also they're not planning their audit plans to allow that to occur. So they're looking to get to a point where they can raise assessments in a much quicker time frame than in the past. And in my view, they are basically bringing, and this is another really important issue, they are basically bringing the evidence gathering and the case theory earlier in the chain, way before litigation, even though these are usually the sorts of things we look at the litigation stage, way up front, so that they can assess the case, not only for assessment, but for resolution, and also be litigation ready. So that's another aspect of this process.
So how has that been resourced? If all this activity is being brought forward, I mean, both from a corporation perspective, being able to actually respond and defend, but equally from the ATO? Well,
the ATO is investing in resources in the teams that it's bringing together to run the audits. They are also, they've been doing a lot of recruiting from externally, but also they are, consulting various experts, etc. However, the bulk of the work is being done by the corporates.
Yes.
And that's another very important aspect of all of this, because it's intensive evidence gathering. That's how I view it.
Yep.
At this stage, much more than that's occurred in the past. So
what impact are you seeing on the corporate tax teams, who also have their business as usual?
It's very confronting and challenging, and they are having to, resourcing, quite apart from the logistics of working out where the information is, does it exist, what they can provide and how responsive they can be. It's how you actually undertake that process with the resources in the companies, and often they don't have that. So sometimes they are actually looking to external resources, and it's a very expensive exercise because it's intense, not only from a resource point of view, but a time point of view. And I think it's proving to be quite challenging. So I think we've talked about a lot of this already. The other aspect that this is an important area in the Commissioner is looking to, as part of understanding the decision-making process within organisations, the Commissioner and what options they considered and what they finally chose to do in relation to a particular transaction, is also looking at the advisors, the advice that companies had been getting, and also what we're seeing is the ATO is looking very closely at privilege claims. We also have seen that the ATO has received data through other means, which people should also be aware. And so, again, I think this goes to the question you just asked, Tony, about the engagement and, heads of tax managers having to, I think, develop another job in addition to their day job when they're faced with something like this, because it's all-consuming. And so there needs to be a lot of engagement with the ATO about the process. The ATO is even asking about search terms and wanting to know search terms. And so it's about understanding how to engage with the ATO as well, and the pressure points that the ATO, its own timeline that the ATO is imposing, and how you navigate your way around that. So, and of course, that's very important for the company to have that engagement with the ATO. And try to get as much sympathy as possible, or empathy, let's put it that way, and recognition of the logistical task that the company has in meeting the timelines, but also where there is, information that would be in the knowledge of former staff. I think that all needs to be understood and explained to the ATO. However, we are seeing very limited empathy on that part, but it's still important that communication and engagement occurs. You
mentioned a little bit earlier that the ATO's asking lots of questions.
Yes.
Digging back quite a long way.
Yes.
But you also mentioned that the questions tend to be in tranches. Are there words of caution, around how you approach that?
Well, the questions aren't necessarily in tranches, but what the ATO is seeking in terms of the manner in which the questions and the documents are responded to is the ATO will impose, because most companies will say to the ATO, will negotiate, information being provided in stages rather than providing it, in 3 months hence, for example. So they'll say, we'll give you a certain amount on this day, another lot the next, in a month's time, etc. And in the most part, companies don't prescribe or say, because they don't know, what information they can give in the first tranche, or it's really about just gathering it and giving it in a way that's suitable to the company. But the ATO is now imposing, and I've seen examples where the ATO is saying, well, in tranche 1, we want you to answer these questions first and provide these documents first, and then tranche 2, they will prescribe what information and documents they want in that context. And that, as we understand, or how it's been explained, is that it fits within the way they are examining the risk and the issue and the risk, and developing their own risk hypothesis about the issue.
There was a slide that we might have skipped over before in relation to electronic audits.
Yes, I did skip over that.
Wanted to get your thoughts on that.
This one, this is something that it's really about being aware that the ATO is very sophisticated in terms of the way it analyses data. And sometimes it's comparing your data that you're providing with information it's received from other sources that you may not be aware of. So, and also you need to understand and be aware that the information that you're providing can also be, the ATO will be reconciling that against tax returns, financial statements, and we've seen recently where the ATO is requesting copies of SMS communications. So that's another frontier that the ATO is pursuing in relation to within the context of these information requests, and also, which is not different but important to, not necessarily different, but important to understand in the context of this process, that the ATO is also now saying to us, well, we're also going to be wanting to interview key people, stakeholders within the organisation, and no doubt they will be testing some of the information that's been provided. So it's about being aware that the ATO is becoming more and more sophisticated in testing the data that you're providing, the responses that you're providing through other means, and also testing how contemporaneous the information you're providing, or contemporaneous to the transaction, is.
What's interesting in this context, when they are conducting a review, they're also taking the opportunity to assess the integrity of your business systems as well. And that, of course, affects your risk profile, which then also affects the level of future engagement as well. So there's also other things that sort of hang off the back of that. Yeah. So that has implications for an organisation.
And it also has implications for how you're responding in this context. That may also impact on a ruling request that you've made earlier, or where you've had another review or audit, where this information might impact. So you need to have a very good overview of. It's not just about gathering the information, providing the responses to the ATO, but the company itself truly understanding and having a good understanding of the information it is dealing with, what story does it tell, and how it may impact the position it has taken from a tax point of view, and does it give rise to any risk that it needs to manage in its engagements going forward with the ATO. So we've talked, sorry, did that answer?
It did, yeah, that was
great.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yep.
And we have dealt with the common focus areas for the information request. I'm happy if you wanted to talk about any of that. Any more? I think we've covered that.
I think we've covered a fair bit. And maybe now's a good time to perhaps switch gears and talk a little bit more about, practical considerations. And might flick over to Tony. I think you had some slides that we're going to talk to.
I do. Do you want to talk about the key takeaway before?
I think, look, in summary, the key takeaway here is selecting you can't do it for every transaction, but I think good governance processes and information retention about transactions is important. But in relation to the key significant transactions that occur within an organisation where it's fairly clear that the ATO is going to come and have a look, or where the ATO has published positions, that contemporaneous evidence about facts, documents, decision-making is available, and also that you understand what it says, and that it also includes communications between key stakeholders in the various decision-making processes. And also, the other key takeaway I think that's probably even more important is understanding that this is a new way that the ATO is operating under, and the old ways of doing this and waiting till the ATO comes and approaches you, it isn't, I don't think, going to work, because it will put you at risk, and some reflection and objective reflection needs to occur about these transactions and how you would go about responding to this sort of request.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Carmen. So
I can relax now.
You can relax now. What I want to follow that up with, I guess, is some of the practical considerations around the discussion this morning, and really sort of focusing in on what is it that actually attracts the ATO to your door. How is the ATO identifying who to target, and the implications and considerations for you. We've touched on some of those in the course of the discussion so far, but just digging into that a little bit further. And then I guess coming back to Jim's earlier question, what we're actually seeing. And it's quite interesting how immature, I guess, a lot of corporates are in this space, and really are scrambling to sort of cover bases as we go through. Yeah. So let's start up with what attracts the ATO, and what better authority than the ATO itself. The points that I have in front of you are actually out of the ATO's Large Business and Tax Compliance publication. And they're stating the obvious, but just working through some of these indicators. Financial or tax performance that varies from industry patterns. So the ATO is very aware of the patterns and the benchmarks across different industries. If your organisation falls outside of that pattern materially, it's going to attract their attention. Yep. Significant variations in amounts or patterns compared to your historical performance, economic indicators, industry trends. So if you're in an industry that is booming and your tax payments are going down, or your organisation is growing, or traditionally your tax payments have grown through the years and there's suddenly a dramatic drop, it's going to raise a question from the ATO. They'll be knocking on your door. Unexplained variation between economic performance and productivity versus tax performance. It's stating the obvious. If you're booming as an organisation but your tax payments are not, it raises questions. Unexplained losses, low effective tax rates, low or no tax is going to attract their attention. So we see that at play with organisations like Apple, for example. And even in the last few weeks, the Financial Review reported how Qantas is reporting high profits and no tax. But then luckily a few days later they reported the new profit results and announced that they are paying some tax. But that does attract attention, not only of the ATO but also the press. History of aggressive tax planning by the corporation, group board members or key executives. So if your organisation has taken a stance that says we are going to take a fairly aggressive risk profile, if your chief executive is standing up in front of the press and announcing how they are entitled to take full advantage of the law and will abide by the letter of the law, that's an open invitation for the tax office to knock on your door and have a bit of a conversation around that. Perceived weaknesses in compliance structures. So integrity of business systems is one of the primary sources of error across the board for any corporation. So if you don't have the right systems, processes and controls in place, your risk profile is going to be up. The ATO is going to want to have a chat about that. It's not because you're deliberately trying to get something wrong. It's just it's inherent in poor systems that you are going to get things wrong.
And that's an interesting point, because we're seeing a huge amount of activity with a lot of our clients that we're working at across corporate Australia, multinationals and large domestics as well, where there's a forensic analysis of systems, controls, processes, manual interjection points, duplicate data sets. So really wanting to understand who's touching the data, who's making modifications, where's the substantiation for adjustments. So that's a very, very hot point of the ATO at the moment.
Absolutely. Conversely, it's interesting that the ATO is wanting to reward organisations that are taking proactive steps. If you look at the cooperative assurance agreement, where you can demonstrate that you've got the appropriate systems and controls and the right levels of automation, you effectively get an audit holiday for certain elements of your GST reporting. Tax outcomes that are inconsistent with policy and the intent of the law. Now, we're seeing that play out quite heavily now in the area of international tax, related party dealings. It's on the front pages, so that's a really good example of where that plays out. The next one's interesting, promotion of tax exploitation schemes. I'm not sure that I've seen a whole lot of corporates that are really out there sort of promoting tax exploitation schemes, but if you are, you should stop pretty quickly. Implementation of transactions that contradict any product rulings that are relevant to that transaction. If the ATO has gone to the trouble to call a position on a particular transaction and you go in a different direction, be prepared to be able to answer those questions as to why. The next one is actually quite an interesting one. Rapid growth, mergers, demergers, major transactions and events. They're the sort of events that tend to be published in the press, and the ATO sees the press as much as we do. Any major change, there is an inherent probability of error, and it would be the possibility of interpretive error in terms of the way you interpret the tax law and how you apply that, and then also the quantitative outcome of that. So once you've actually made those decisions, how you actually reflect that in your tax return and your account. So that will attract attention. And of course, businesses employing strategies that erode the corporate tax base. So we see a bit of press around Singapore hubs, operations in Ireland, and so on. So they're the sort of elements that are going to attract the ATO, I would think. Yep. So how's the ATO identifying who to target? And look, there's lots of different avenues where you can be drawn to the attention of the ATO. So I've sort of tried to grab, I guess, some of the headlines. And the first one's probably the interesting one. It's unprecedented insights. So if you look at focusing on the leadership in itself, Chris Jordan, Jeremy Herschel, Andrew Mills, a lot of others that have come out of industry, they have been working with organisations and helping them structure their transactions and the organisation itself for many, many years. So and they've also, in that, would have experienced, I guess, a lot of legitimate schemes and schemes that maybe are not that legitimate. So they come in with a body of knowledge that they've brought into the ATO that the ATO previously didn't have. So they know where to look and the sort of things that organisations are happy to do.
Yeah, just on the justified trust, I have had experience recently, and I'd really be interested to hear from anyone in the audience about this, that where there's been a long process, a justified trust process with a particular organisation. But at the same time, there is significant that the ATO has chosen to then take matters to audit. So it's a very interesting parallel process that's been happening as well. So I'm not quite sure how that fits into the justified trust element, but I think that there is a lot of information gathering going on as part of that process, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to just result in some, the whatever objective the ATO is seeking from that justified trust, but it could also give rise to audit activity as well.
And it's true, isn't it? Because the conversation around justified trust, please tell me why I should trust what you're reporting to me, does open up conversations that were previously not there.
Opens up more than conversations, unfortunately.
Yep, definitely. In addition to the leadership, we were talking a little bit about the profile of people that the ATO is starting to bring in. The ATO is starting to bring in a lot of data scientists and people that are expert at digging into data analytics, machine learning, and that opens up a whole new dimension that was previously not there. Leaks, such as the Panama Papers, so we talked about that a little bit earlier, is providing even deeper insights, and as you saw from Chris Jordan's quote, they're very much paying attention to that.
And the Paradise Papers.
The Paradise Papers, yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Electronic media, internet, newspapers, like us, they do read the paper, they do surf the net. they do look out for large transactions, mergers, acquisitions. They are triggers for questions.
Yeah, and the ATO have actually brought in a lot of technology sets that can actually allow them to data match, so automatically data match these different disparate data sources. So there has also been remote reaching into foreign subsidiaries and parent companies, their financial statements that have been disclosed to other regulators around the world, and again, data matching back with what's been disclosed in the ATO's records. So again, lots of different information sources, and the technology is available for them to identify a risk quite quickly and act accordingly.
It's actually, when you dig into that a little bit further, it's still very early days, and people talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and people would have heard of IBM's Watson. Now, I know the ATO is looking at Watson as an example, and when you look at where Watson's used in other areas, Watson can actually go through and interrogate social media, emails, voice, photographs, as well as documents and data in the traditional sense. And because of the processing power and the algorithms within that, can actually start bringing matches that no human can. So that's still very early days in that technology, but that's emerging, and that's something to be conscious of in the medium to long term as well.
Yep.
Transparency. Now, transparency is, I guess, the secret weapon, I guess, of the 21st century. And I say that because on the surface, it looks fairly innocuous. I need to disclose certain information. We've got the Voluntary Transparency Code. We see BEPS on a global level. I'm just showing some information. There's no tax implications, but the information that you're disclosing is providing visibility to the ATO as well as regulators all over the world on your operations anywhere in the world. So if you look at, say, CBC reporting, 3 little figures, your total revenue, how much tax you pay, and how many people are actually working in a particular jurisdiction, speaks volumes of potential intercompany transactions and sort of really avoiding your fair share of tax. So as innocuous as it may be, it's actually quite lethal as well. And then global regulatory authorities are sharing data, as we talked about a little bit earlier, as well as actually the ATO collecting data from organisations, from banks and dividend and interest payments, as well as contractor engagements. So they have unprecedented insights and the technology to then dig into that. So that's just some of the insights that the ATO has now. Going down to the next level is just risk profiling. So in Australia, we moved away from random audits to audits based on an organisation's risk profile. So there's a whole bunch of factors that the ATO will take into account to work out the profile of your organisation and then determine the level of engagement. So the higher the risk your organisation is deemed to be, the higher the level of engagement, the more likely it is that you're going to have the ATO camping in your boardroom and digging into things. So there's a whole bunch of factors that feed into that risk profile, and some of those I've listed here. So the organisational attitude to risk. So if you come from an organisation that is overtly aggressive and likes to play in the grey and go right up against the line, okay, the profile of your organisation is likely to be high. Your risk profile is going to be high. Some organisations are in industries where just the size of the nature and the complexity of the organisation just raises risks in itself. So if you look at the large banks as an example, whilst they have a lot of good governance, just the nature of the operations is such that there are risks involved in sort of getting that, having errors. The organisational compliance history. So if your organisation has a history of error or issues in the past, that's going to raise your risk profile going forward. The next one we talked about earlier, information systems risk assessment. So integrity of business systems. If your organisation is still relying on Excel, and it's actually quite scary how many organisations still do, your risk profile is going to be up there, right? On the other extreme, if you have high levels of automation, controls and processes, that risk profile diminishes. So the integrity of your business system is actually quite key, because even with the best intentions in the world, you are going to get things wrong if the right systems are in place. And where that plays out quite interestingly is in the area of GST, which is quite innocuous. Everybody says it's 10% tax, it's really easy. And yet, in terms of underpayment of tax, and they don't talk about overpayment of tax, we're talking 250 to 300 million per year. So we were talking $1 billion every 3 years of inadvertent errors. And a large source of that is integrity of business systems. And then the last one I've got there is responsiveness and response to the ATO question. So we talked about that at length. So if you're unable to respond within a reasonable time period, or your response is not adequate, that's just going to trigger more questions and a deeper dive. So that's risk profiling. new powers and concepts. So we talked about justified trust. So that's opening new conversations. That opens new doors to new avenues, and I guess maybe discussions you don't want to have.
New issues.
New issues. And then targeted questioning. So Carmen talked extensively in terms of the breadth and the depth of the questioning that comes through. So if you've got particular events, restructures, transactions, be prepared that they're going to be digging in a lot further than anything you've seen before. All right, this page is really around, I guess, the tools, the methodologies, and what's emerging in the technology area and the depth of information that they're seeking. So the tax office and regulators around the world are using far more sophisticated tools and methodologies than they've had before. So whilst the tax office has always had, I guess, information about taxpayers for many years, they haven't necessarily had the tools and the infrastructure to be able to use that. Now they actually have the structure where they can store all the data, and they have the tools where they can start data mining, they can start benchmarking information, they can start running trend analysis within your organisation. So what have your disclosures been like over the last 10 years? Where are the anomalies? Where are the blips? And digging into those. Reconciliation, so reconciling your tax return to your BAS return to your accounts, digging into your assets and the underlying information that goes under that. So the tax office has a tremendous number of tools and now the expertise in terms of the data scientists to actually start digging into those.
Yep.
And what we are actually seeing in the field is the ATO is actually going out and running trend analysis on client data. In the context of GST, they're actually taking transactional information and running it through their own systems to identify anomalies within that. So they're running data analytics themselves.
That's interesting. You can see a time not too far away where the ATO would be mandating the provision of this information, the actual underlying transactional data across to the ATO, so that they can almost pre-audit test as part of a compliance process. But we are seeing, to add to that point there, the ATO spending a lot more time with data scientists on premise at corporates, digging into those systems and looking at the transactions that substantiate those tax adjustments that have been made. So yeah, interesting patterns emerging there, and that activity is only going to go up. Yep. So in response to that, we're seeing that corporates are then investing more into their systems to ensure that they are in a position to again provide transparency and confidence to the ATO that they're already undertaking those tests themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of emerging, I'll sort of jump to the last point. So we talked a little bit of artificial intelligence and machine learning. There is a lot of press around artificial intelligence and machine learning. It is actually still very early days in our part of the world, but it is an incredibly powerful capability that will come online over the years ahead. Robotics will increasingly be used to actually automate a lot of the processes in terms of sort of digging into the data and looking for anomalies again. So watch this space because this will only grow as the years progress. Yep. In terms of the depth of analysis, and we've spent a bit of time talking about that, is really the tax office is seeking the evidence to be able to dig in. And what we're finding is, particularly in the compliance space, and then also in your experience in terms of the interpretation, organisations don't really have their data together. It's stored in emails, hard drives, people's heads, and when it comes time to answer questions, it's really difficult to pull that together. And notwithstanding the existence of systems where you can do that, people are not taking advantage of that, probably as a matter of awareness, probably because they're too busy to do that as well. So they're caught up.
And again, that's why it's important, I think, at the very least, to be somewhat selective, understandably, about in some of the deeper dive analysis and evidentiary support, particularly for the what I call potential high-risk transactions, high risk from the ATO's perspective, is very important to design a process by which you are storing the data, the contemporaneous information that speaks to those elements that the ATO is looking at, not just data storage. Yeah. It really needs to be able to then be retrieved to be responsive to the way the ATO is asking the questions and referring it to the legislation, like the elements of the legislation.
And then also to be relevant to support the transaction.
Indeed. Well, the other aspect of all of this that I haven't touched on is that unfortunately, companies often, whilst they have some, or whether it's corporate memory, recollection, where people are still in the company who were involved at the time of the transaction, have recollection. It doesn't mean that there is evidence that supports recollection or even a position. And it's also an opportunity to ensure that you are managing risk by ensuring that your evidence is in place, because that's what all of this is about. And certainly the ATO is getting your evidence together, but may not necessarily be supporting your position. So you need to understand that.
And I think in that context, my last point there about not limited to numbers, right? It's not just about the numbers, and it's not about your query sheets and the letters of advice. Emails, SMS messages, and you're going to see more of that going forward. And the damage an email can do. Chevron's a really good example of the damage that an email can do. Yep, lots and lots of examples around that. So the depth of analysis extends well beyond the pure numbers and the letters of advice and what's behind your return and your disclosures immediately. So everything that surrounds that as well. So you need to be conscious of that. Okay. So the implications and considerations is really you need to be prepared. So we talked a little bit earlier in terms of what we're seeing in industry, and some organisations are starting to put some governance and some infrastructure in place prospectively. But there's a lot more to it. It's actually also looking at it retrospectively, because the tax office is going back many years. So you in some cases more than 10 years.
Critical to do that. Critical.
So looking at some of the elements of that at a very high level. You really should be going back and assessing your organisation's risk profile and the attitude to risk. Really understand your risks and your exposures. And what I mean by that is digging in and finding those transactions and those events that have had a substantial impact on your tax profile. So changes the amount of tax that you pay if you've got related party dealings with your overseas related companies. You really need to start going back and re-digging into those and actually being able to see that the approach that's been taken is valid. Review the documentation that supports that and see whether it actually does support that. Review the systems that support that and see that it supports that. And then really dig into non-traditional areas like checking out the emails and checking out the communications between the people that were the decision makers around each of those events. So just digging into that a little bit further, I talk a little bit about qualitative risk assessment and quantitative risk assessment. So by qualitative risk, I am talking about the tax positions that you take, the technical interpretation. And what you'll see, I'm going to repeat the theme, I guess, we talked about earlier, as well as what I've just mentioned before. So in that context, identification and proper treatment of tax exposures, review materials, transaction and events. So when you go through the last few years, identify those major events and dig into those a little bit further. You need to manage your uncertain tax positions and be fairly certain that the position you've taken is supportable and you've got the evidence that you need to be able to support that. If you need to revisit those, actually revisit the letters of advice, revisit the evidence that you have. Make sure that it's in line with the law, make sure it's in line with the organisation's risk appetite and also the ATO's tax policy.
Yeah. Also, if the company hasn't done this retrospective, reflective exercise, at least I think it's a really good idea to think about it at the start of a risk review, because the ATO will commence with a risk review and ask certain questions during that process. But if it's a transaction which the ATO will tell you fairly early on that they regard it as high risk, then I would definitely start thinking about examining the information in the organisation where in anticipation of one of these significant information requests, because I have not really experienced anyone that's been adequately prepared for such a thing.
That's a big message in itself, isn't it?
Yes, and unfortunately it's true.
Yep. So, in that context, they're very much sort of digging in and checking your evidence.
Yeah, and when I say not prepared, it's really around the time, being able to be responsive to the strict timeframes and being able to gather the information efficiently.
The off the back of that, so we talk about sort of the evidence and reviewing communication, like emails. Any thoughts in terms of engaging with the regulator? Because it's a double-edged sword in terms of where you've got something that's fairly significant in terms of its impact on tax.
What do you mean? Sorry, I'm not quite sure.
So sometimes when you've got a new transaction, engaging with the regulator with your interpretation of how it should be treated.
Yes.
In advance.
Well, you could do that in advance with an early engagement process, and where you might end up getting some sort of indication about the position you're seeking to take, and usually that culminates in a private binding ruling. And that's great. However, I have seen an example recently where a private binding ruling has been obtained, but the ATO has subsequently thought, well, look, there is risk in this in a related transaction, but it can also then bring that transaction on which a ruling's been obtained into play, and they're asking for further information. So I think it's very important to do that, particularly in uncertain cases or high-risk type transactions, but it will not necessarily immunise you from the further inquiries, but very important to do that.
Okay. Would you ever do it on old transactions? So retrospectively?
It would be very difficult to do it that way because you would have already taken positions, unless you do it within a period where you can still amend or perhaps self-object or whatever that is. Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to quantitative risk. So qualitative risk is the process by which you decide how you are going to treat a particular transaction or a particular structure. Quantitative risk, I guess, is the pointy end because it's the numbers that go to the regulator that report the position that you've taken. And as I mentioned earlier, the integrity of business system is probably one of the biggest sources of error that the ATO is focused on. So organisations should focus on this area a fair bit, and we're starting to see a little bit of movement on the side of some corporates. And there's a number of elements to that. The first thing is actually focusing in on your systems, your processes, and your controls. And where you want to move to is to get to a point of being able to provide positive assurance both to your board and your executive as well as the regulator that your processes are robust enough to be able to produce the correct result in the first instance. And I know the tax office is very receptive to that, and we've seen that in the cooperative assurance agreement where you can get to a point where if you can convince the ATO that you've got a sufficiently robust process and system and controls in place, they will give you effectively an audit holiday for certain elements of your disclosures around BAS. So that's actually quite important. In that context, it's really important that you start minimising your reliance on spreadsheets. A lot of organisations do, and spreadsheets will never disappear, but they can't be the background of what you're doing. And if you continue to do that, it's actually going to be quite costly for you because it's not only the errors, so independent studies will tell you 90% plus errors, but it's also the time that you spend then actually fielding questions because that raises your risk profile, which means the tax office is knocking on your door asking you more questions.
Yeah.
The converse of that is the ideal that you're working for is to try and minimise the number of systems that you're using for managing compliance and reporting. So when we talk to clients, what we see is an array of Excel, point solutions, paper, web, just manual calculations. Utopia is really to try and have one platform where you can manage all your compliance and reporting as well as keep all your evidence, have it like an evidence repository, so that one, you do have a robust system in place. Secondly, when we start talking about trend analysis and analytics and digging in, if you can actually have everything in one place, one database, it then allows you to actually dig into that history and start looking for anomalies.
Yeah. And what's been really interesting too is we've been approached a lot by the ATO and equally a few of our corporate clients as well to to actually educate and train the ATO on these platforms. So the ATO are, again, they've got data scientists and technologists who understand this stuff, and they want to get into the detail. They don't want to wait for it to be disclosed. Give us real-time access. So they're asking for, give us access at the point in time that you're booking provisions, disclosing returns, so that we can actually understand your business better.
Absolutely. So that's the first part, I guess, around systems technology, your systems, your processes and controls. The second element really goes back to the qualitative risk. So again, review some of the major transactions that have a big impact on your tax payments, and really review the treatment and make sure that the numeric outcome of that reflects what it should be. The next piece is really sort of mirroring in advance what the ATO is now doing. Dashboarding, data analytics, trend analysis. So you should have the history of all your disclosures. So it can really start fairly simply. So we have clients that are engaging us at the moment to start building our trend analysis reports around their ATO form disclosures, around their BAS disclosures, their international dealing schedules, and just simply mapping that over a period of 5 or 10 years will actually start picking up any anomalies which should raise a question in your mind for you to dig in advance of the ATO knocking on your door. And there might be good reasons for those anomalies, but at least have a story behind those. Evidence, again, you need to start collecting your evidence, try and make sure that it's available and accessible, and then really review that evidence, particularly for your really large transactions, to make sure it actually supports the position that you're taking. The next piece as well is just ensure that your staff are properly equipped and trained. So in our experience, when we're out implementing systems, one of the key pieces that we do is we do train people, and more often than not, we have, in the tax context, we'll have people that have a tax background. But it actually surprised me how often we strike people that have no tax background whatsoever, and yet they're making decisions around tax treatment. You want to get those people trained up to make sure that they know what they're doing.
That brings an interesting point actually in relation to outsourcing versus insourcing of corporate tax compliance obligations. So there's been a fairly large amount of swinging back and forth between outsourcing and insourcing. But what's your views, Tony, then in relation to maintaining ownership and control over systems, processes, and ensuring that you actually understand those adjustments? How do you approach that? So
it's a good segue into controlling your data. So look, over the years, I've been in the industry for long enough to see that there's fashions like everything else. So when I first started in tax, the big fashion was whether you'd centralise or decentralise the tax function. Now there's a lot of discussion around outsourcing or insourcing certain elements of your tax capability. At its most extreme, we've seen organisations like GE that have outsourced the entirety of their tax function to organisations outside. Now, there's lots of pros and cons of outsourcing versus insourcing, but the one piece that's a sleeper and a lot of organisations don't think about is, whilst you're actually outsourcing the task, you don't think about the data, right? And so let's just look at a practical scenario. I make a decision today to outsource my tax return preparation. The reality is I'll give that to a professional advisor. They might do that for 3 or 4 years. I might decide to change advisor at that point. So what happens is all my tax returns have been prepared on the internal systems at the advisor. I've moved to a new advisor. I've lost that history. The new advisor takes over 3 years down the track. You decided to bring it back in-house. You've lost that history again. So really, the observation around outsourcing and insourcing, some people will go one way or another, and there's good arguments either way. But I think in today's world, where the regulators are starting to dig in and do trend analysis and data analytics over your data, you really need to be controlling your data. And it is entirely possible in today's world with cloud solutions for you to be totally in control of your systems and your data, and then allow your advisor to go in and actually do the calculations for you. And then when you move, you actually don't lose that history. And plus, in the meantime, you can do all your analytics. Yeah,
it's a model that we've seen more and more corporations, particularly in Australia, uptaking that kind of delivery model where they will manage the hosting of the system for all tax compliance and reporting, but opening up to selected service providers to be involved in that compliance process. But it's done on their premise in terms of their data, maintaining that control. And I guess the other thing too is if there is a switch from one provider to another provider, they will obviously, as part of their contract, provide you with the historical records that support the tax returns, but it won't necessarily be in a consumable form, which is then easily obtained under audit or compared over periods of time for analysis.
The other side of that, which is actually quite interesting, I'm aware of situations where an advisor has been asked to provide historical data in the context of a tax audit and has been reticent to bring some of that data to the fore simply because they were potentially implicated in the audit in that environment as well. So that's actually a different side to that story. So really you should have control of your evidence, your data, your history, so you have that flexibility. I guess the counter side to that as well is that the beauty of that is it does give you a better negotiating power if you do want to change advisors down the track as well. Yeah. So that's another benefit, I guess. Next item is, I guess, closer engagement with the regulator. Now, it is a double-edged sword, but there are some areas which are quite clearly you should be engaging closer. So we talked about positive assurance in the context of GST. There's some real benefits for you to have robust systems and processes in place so that you don't get disturbed by certain elements of audit. Annual compliance arrangements, that sets up a framework where you can work cooperatively with the ATO and address, I guess, the sticky issues. And it was interesting, yesterday we ran a session on diverted profits tax and the practical implications of that. And the ATO specifically mentioned yesterday that if you are in fear of getting a diverted profits tax assessment, if you raise that with the ATO under cover of an ACA, they will not issue you with an assessment. All right, so they will actually deal with that within the context of the ACA. So it's one way of actually sort of avoiding, I guess, that outcome. And then the cooperative assurance agreements as well in terms of just the analytics over your data and the system integrity. And then
Sorry, just a quick time check. We're sort of in the last 5 minutes of thereabouts.
Okay.
Closing.
The last piece. So the executive and board engagement. The last piece is it's really important for you to get the buy-in of the executive and the board. For many years, the tax function has been the poor cousin of the finance function, but it has very real implications now for an organisation if you get it wrong. Extensive audits, tying up a lot of time with the ATO and with the regulator, reputational damage when you end up on the front page of the paper. So your board and your executive needs to be aware of the repercussions around tax. They need to be aware of your key issues. They need to be aware and comfortable that you have the right systems and processes in place to make sure that you get it right. And then ultimately, the counter side to that is they need to be aware to the point that they provide you with the funding and the support to be able to put the right systems and processes in place. Because as we've seen, all of these events actually take up a lot of time. And you really need the funding and the people to be able to deal with it. Yeah, we've actually had a lot of corporates that have really struggled to actually articulate the business case and put together a case because, of course, a lot of this is qualitative and what's the actual real true cost. Pretty hard to anticipate that, but seeing now that the board are taking a much more active involvement in tax risk and are being a lot more supportive of those requests for funding. Yep, definitely. So that's basically, the last one was what we actually said, but we've pretty much covered a lot of that. Right. The reality out there is at the moment is that the people are not looking at the past. They don't have the integrated systems in place. Some organisations are starting to address that, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I mean, ultimately, how do you actually get a good picture of your organisation if you don't actually have the underlying systems and processes to be able to tie that data together?
Great.
So that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much for your time today, Carmen, Tony, for delivering some great insights, and thanks for your questions to the people who are there watching the webcast. We have a lot more events this year via the CCH networks, which we'll be keeping you informed of. So thanks for your time today, and I hope you got some value out of it.